Thank you so much for that kind introduction. There's always a bit of a Woody Allen moment when you hear yourself being introduced. But it's such a pleasure for me to be here, and I'd like to extend my thanks to Lothar for the invitation and the honour to be here at Leopoldina with you over this few days. And thank you to all of you in the room and those who are online for joining on a Saturday morning. It's not the most social of time to be talking about social science and Ebola and public health emergencies, so thank you for that too. Maybe just as a little bit of background to start with, I should just give a little overview as to Anthropologica. This is an organisation that I set up now 14 years ago when I had finished my PhD at Oxford. And to be perfectly honest, by the time I'd finished my PhD, I was rather disillusioned with academic anthropology and felt that there was a much more applied, a much more operational and practical component to the discipline. I wanted to really try to develop and build a much more rigorous qualitative evidence base that could be used in global health to help shape programs and interventions in the strategy of global health overall. But since then, happily, social science and anthropology has gained greater visibility and greater traction in the arena of global health. Social scientists have long worked on public health, both in terms of applying their skills to public health, but also applying a critical, reflexive lens on public health as well, and in multiple contexts, so across humanitarian and crisis contexts, as well as in higher income settings. But certainly the Ebola epidemic in West Africa was a catalyst for bringing about a change in the role of the role and position of anthropology and social science in public health emergencies. So whilst the public health community had drawn on social science for decades, it was suddenly very evident to other responders that we needed to better understand the social, political, economic and cultural fabric of the affected and at-risk communities that we were working with. Perhaps one of the most quoted examples of the way that anthropology was used during the West African outbreak is in terms of burials. Following standard operating procedures for what was then termed dead body management meant that bodies were disposed of in a medically safe way at the beginning of the outbreak, with at least initially very little interface or interaction with customary burial practices. But as any one of you here today knows, if you've cared for a loved one, if you've buried or you've cremated a loved one, that act of burial or cremation doesn't stand alone in time. It's not just an isolated activity, but it links to notions of identity, to heritage, to social fabric and connections, to forging ties to the past, to forging ties to the future, to memory, to position in society. So the importance of when and how and who helps to mark the end of life should never be underestimated. And it took too long, and it had negative ramifications in the ways that bodies were disposed of at the beginning of the West African outbreak. It had far-reaching consequences that we were actually dealing with for the rest of the outbreak, and to be honest, since then as well. And I think we've seen some of those similar influences playing out in COVID, unfortunately, over the last few years. But we were able to show that it wasn't the whole of burial practices that needed to be changed or needed to be amended. It was just those components that made customary burials medically unsafe that resulted in an unacceptable high level of risk when it came to transmission. So we demonstrated that actually the standard operating procedures could be very much tailored to the local contexts. And eventually the very term dead body management was shifted first to safe burials and then to safe and dignified burials. Another less often discussed example is the mobility of communities, and I wanted to put this in just in light of some of the conversations we had yesterday around the movement of people. So working with colleagues from the UN Habitat in Monrovia, we were able to identify and to map the mobility patterns of different communities travelling between the capital, and this is an aerial shot of Monrovia I took in 2014. So the mobility of people between the capital to other areas of the country, sometimes for education, sometimes for trade and livelihoods, often just because of the close connections that they had with their natal villages. Unsurprisingly, to those of us in the room today, that pattern of mobility mapped very closely on top of the routes of transmission. But we began to then be able to learn about these patterns of mobility, to almost be able to predict where we were more likely to see spikes in transmission and be able to link that to specific small population groups that actually were sort of geographically quite dispersed, and how we link those to specific events over time. But often we are far too slow to learn from communities, to take the time to ask questions and to absorb a range of opinions. We may listen to what we know we need to know, but it's not always that information. It's also just the information that we don't yet know that we need to know. I'm sorry, that's going to be complicated for the translators. There are known knowns. There are things we know we need to know, but there are also things that we don't know that we need to know at a point of time, but which could turn out to be significant. So it's a truism that silence speaks louder than words, but being sensitive to what's not being said is often as important in these contexts as to what is being said and the underlying drivers of behaviour. But it's not only about what we're asking, it's about how we are asking these questions, how we are interfacing with communities, how we are gathering data from various different sources. And how we do that in different contexts. Obviously, from the previous picture to this, how you engage with communities, how you do contact tracing, how you do surveillance is very different in different types of environments. And over the last few years, there's been some really interesting developments in community feedback mechanisms led by the International Federation of the Red Cross and the National Societies, by Oxfam and other organisations who were there on the ground even before an event happens and the international circus of a response sort of rolls in. And that's very much linked to our commitment to accountability to affected populations. But frequently, we are engaging with the key influences in society, and Irene showed this in one of her slides. We go to the key influences, the chiefs, the women leaders, the youth leaders, the civil society representatives. But what about the general public? What about the normal person? This is a series of photographs that I took in an area of Freetown called Moor Wharf in 2014. It's a nice area for pigs to live in, not such a nice area for people. Here you can see a quarantine rope that had been put in. So from this house, there'd been 4 high-risk contacts of an Ebola patient. And so the quarantine rope had gone up the day before I went in to take these photographs. And as you can see, it was a very difficult area to work in. Responders were very nervous about going into this particular informal settlement to work. And I came across these guys. They lived next door to the house that I just showed you with the quarantine rope. Nobody had spoken to them. They live in the middle of Moor Wharf. They knew everybody. They knew who was connected with who. They knew the movement of people in and out of the area. They knew who had been interacting with who kind of formally and informally. They had so much information that was really, really critical to be able to do some contact tracing, to be able to provide information to people about signs and symptoms, but nobody had engaged with them because they didn't fit into our neatly packaged idea about who it is we should be engaging with. So I think time and time again, we ask communities to trust us, to trust the response, to trust public health actors. And I think issues of trust were raised a number of times in different presentations yesterday. But until we start to have trust in communities, there's always going to be this power imbalance between them and us. And if that remains, it puts us in a weaker position than we often think we are in. So it's very easy to advocate for a whole of society approach, but in practice it's far more challenging. We saw this during Ebola, we've seen it recently during COVID-19. People ask, how do you shift the responsibility to the individual, to individual actions, so that people are responsible for the collective? But by the time you actually pose that question around individual responsibility, it's often too late. In West Africa, it became a sort of terribly fashionable to be an anthropologist, to be a social scientist. But there was also this idea that anthropologists and social scientists could be used as silver bullets. We could be dropped into a community where there was conflict between the community and the response teams, and both of those were under immense pressure and asked to sort of resolve that conflict. But actually, we ended up finding us quite often that we were having to be as articulate about what we couldn't do as anthropologists and social scientists as about what we had spent years advocating that we could do in these kinds of environments. But this two-way flow of information is critical. At the start of an outbreak, obviously you need to push out a lot of information around signs and symptoms, around where to go for treatment, how to protect yourself, etc. But we need to be learning from the communities, the at-risk and the affected communities, much more quickly and making sure that there is this two-way flow of information. How do we use different points of information? How do we triangulate those different data points? How do we link it to the epidemiological data to really build a much more 360-degree picture? And we don't work in a vacuum. We know a lot about the context in where these events are happening. And again, Irene touched on this in her presentation. But how do we use that contextual information, that knowledge, to shape a response strategy and to shape specific interventions on the ground? I think we did this really effectively during Ebola in DRC in North Kivu. Responders knew how to deal with an Ebola outbreak, but many of the responders had never been to North Kivu before, and the context that we were working in North Kivu was, I think, arguably more complex, more challenging than any of the previous Ebola outbreaks that we'd had to engage with. The political relationship between North Kivu and Kinshasa, the ongoing conflict, real security concerns for the communities as well as for the responders themselves, the dynamic border areas between North Kivu with Rwanda and Uganda, South Sudan and Burundi. And to many, Ebola was not a priority. It might have been our priority from a global health security perspective, but it was never going to be a priority to many of the at-risk communities on the ground when compared to other factors in their daily life: water shortages, food insecurity, ongoing conflicts. So for many of the populations we work with, this notion of choice, of being able to choose to adapt a behavior or assume a new behavior, is a luxury, and we mustn't forget that. It's very easy for us to say you need to wash your hands regularly, but if there's no water, there's structural barriers there about how you go ahead with that behavior. If you're living on less than $1 a day, how do you stay at home when actually you need to hustle to get food on a daily basis for your children or for your elderly parents? So we have to be aware that people don't always have the agency to act in the way that they would like to act. And it's not always possible for people to be compliant with public health and social measures. And I think we can all reflect on this based on our own experiences of COVID-19. And I think, as Eva will discuss in her presentation later this morning, public health and social measures have far-reaching and long-term consequences, some of which I think we're only just starting to understand now. But as human beings, we're very resilient. And again, as I smiled as I saw Irene's slide, because she used exactly the same word as I was planning to. Culture and society is not static. We are constantly evolving. People don't want to expose themselves to high levels of risk. They want to be able to draw on the resources that they have in their previous experiences to be able to protect themselves to the degree that's possible. These are two photographs taken by a very good colleague of mine, Professor Melissa Parker, who's at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and has done years and years of research in Sierra Leone. And And these are pictures of homemade PPE. So knowing that they didn't have resources for personal protective equipment, but that they had to be caring for people with Ebola in their communities. These are examples of homemade PPE. And actually, the guy on the right, as you look at the screen, he was a motorbike driver, a boda driver, and this became his sort of daily outfit whilst he was moving people around on the back of his motorbike, whereas this other person here on the other side actually cared for 6 members of their family with Ebola and never contracted it himself. So the application of anthropology and social science in recent outbreaks has led us, myself, my colleagues as social scientists, to really reconsider our discipline. And I'd suggest that we have created, or at least strengthened, a sub-discipline around applying social science in public health emergencies. How do you take long-established methodologies, ethnographic methodologies, and make those fit for purpose within a response, within the time pressure of a response? We've had to take quite a critical, reflexive lens to the way in which we work and the way in which we convey that knowledge and that intelligence. Many of the social scientists who were deployed into the Ebola response in West Africa came from really strong academic backgrounds, but they weren't familiar with the architecture of the response or at the speed at which things move. And it was a very uncomfortable position for many people to actually be asked as a researcher to provide evidence and knowledge there and then, which was going to have implications on the interventions, on the operations, to really think through what that means for the logistics of a response, working with colleagues to make a judgment based on action and cost benefits to already strained resources. I remember being asked if it would make a significant difference if the response gave white body bags rather than black body bags to Muslim families in West Africa. And on paper, you might say, well, yes, that seems a sensible thing to do, but then you look at the logistics of what that meant in practice, the money that had already been spent buying the black body bags, the logistics of flying it, commissioning, procuring, flying in white body bags for Muslim communities. There are all these other facets that need to be taken into consideration, which, when you're a social scientist not used to working in that kind of architecture, is very, very difficult. I remember a really excellent report that anthropologists, colleagues who were embedded with epidemiological teams in Liberia worked on, but by what I would term a cruel twist of fate, their reports became available on the day that Liberia was declared Ebola-free. So certainly their report built our learning for future epidemics, for future Ebola outbreaks, but it wasn't of any use to the incident management team, to the president's office, to the response workers, to the communities who were trying to manage that particular outbreak. So that's not to say that we don't need longer-term research. Of course we do. But there's a broad spectrum of different types of data that we need to be drawing on and triangulating at different points in time. Now, the Social Science and Humanitarian Action Platform has been at the forefront of some of this evolving work. It was established back in 2016 after the West Africa Ebola outbreak, and it's a tripartite relationship between the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, Anthropologica, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And Anthropologica really brings sort of the applied operational lens to the rigorous research that's done at IDS and at the London School. It's currently funded by the Wellcome Trust in the UK and also the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office, so FCDO. We produce evidence on demand drawing on what is already known about a given context, as I've said, but really trying to mesh what is already known with emerging issues coming from the ground, always drawing on established networks of expert advisors from different disciplinary backgrounds, different geographic expertise, different thematic expertise. And again, this has sort of been a model that we've developed over the last few years, but proved hugely helpful during the response to Ebola in North Kivu, where we worked with colleagues who had really long research connections in the affected areas and also in the borderlands with the high priority neighbouring countries. So producing evidence on demand means giving verbal briefings, producing white papers, sometimes longer white papers, but oftentimes producing documents that are 1 or 2 pages in length. And initially, we were really criticised for this from our more academic colleagues. The number of times people have said to me, how can you be so reductionist? How can you take the complexity of this situation, of this population group, and try to synthesize it down onto 1 or 2 pages? And my response to that is always because it's based on huge amounts of background research over a long period of time. In the work that I do in emergencies, I'm sometimes in a position where I have 3 minutes to brief senior leadership on a particular issue, be it a cultural issue, something to do with the social fabric or the public authority of a particular area. So we can always do a deeper dive into any of these issues, but how do you actually take that wealth of knowledge from many, many colleagues working over a long period of time and really try to identify what it is that is significant to a response at a certain point of in a certain point of time, in a certain way? How do you best convey that information? So as well as the evidence on demand piece, we've also developed and supported training for the pre-deployment training for social scientists to help those who want to be deployed into emergencies to better understand the architecture, the structures that they're going to be working in. And also we're working very closely with agencies who recognize the value of social science, want to be able to incorporate it, but maybe don't have the in-house expertise to be able to do that yet. So we've developed a series of tailored or bespoke technical assistance workshops that we're rolling out with a number of organizations. We also have a fellowship program. We've just launched our 4th round of the fellowship program, which is trying to match practitioners and social scientists from different regions. And in this new phase of funding that we're just going into now, we're aiming to set up 2 regional SHAP hubs, one in East Africa and one in West Africa. So these are very mutually supportive streams of activity. They're very practical, they're very applied in orientation, but I think perhaps one of the most exciting aspects of SHAP, for me at least, is one that has actually developed quite organically, and I don't think we had necessarily expected when we began, and that's the convening role that we now play. So SHAP is independent. We work across organisations, and we always make our work publicly available. So this really helps to ensure that the socio-behavioural evidence that we're working with isn't siloed within a particular organisation or a particular pillar of a response, that it doesn't have bureaucratic gatekeepers. And again, I think this harks back to some of the conversation we had yesterday about the availability of data and the sharing of data. So whilst we continue to work on COVID-19, we're also responding to other priorities, to monkeypox, to cholera in Malawi. Earlier this week, we facilitated a round table on the drought and food insecurity in the Horn of Africa, bringing together key actors from different organizations from across the whole region. And now we're currently looking at, this is my job on the plane home this afternoon, is to really get to grips with the new Ebola outbreak in Uganda. And just as a side note, we talked a little bit yesterday around trust and vaccinations. It's worth just noting that the vaccine that we have for Ebola, we don't know whether it's going to be effective at all for this new outbreak. This outbreak is the Sudan strain. It's a much rarer strain of Ebola, whereas the Zaire strain is the vaccine that we have. So if you think about all those issues of trust that we talked about yesterday, actually now we're facing more challenges in communication around vaccines, because maybe we're not going to be able to offer protective vaccines during this Uganda outbreak. And how do you roll back on the communication that's happened over the last few years with outbreaks in DRC, where we've really been advocating for ring vaccination and for uptake in vaccination? So in terms of role and positioning of social science, a great deal has changed since 2014. Which is why I wanted to call my presentation today Beyond Ebola. And I think most of that change has happened for the better. The need for incorporating social science knowledge, evidence and expertise is now widely accepted, although how it's incorporated and when it's incorporated still remains problematic. The financing has improved. Organisations such as the Wellcome Trust, Glopid-R, the Gates Foundation have been providing increased access to resources, but there still remains a big funding gap, and often the funding that comes through is reactive and in an emergency setting can be quite delayed. And individual agencies and organisations from WHO to UNICEF to IFRC to the Robert Koch Institute here in Germany are building their internal capacity for social and behavioural science. But the response architecture means that still too often social science is siloed into risk communication and community engagement or into social behaviour change, rather than being a fundamental foundation across the whole of a response, shaping the strategic approach and interventions. So in 2019, just a few months before COVID-19 gripped the world, I collaborated with colleagues on an article that was published in Nature, a new 21st century science for effective epidemic response. And in that, we argued that the current demographic transitions driven by population growth, by rapid urbanization, by deforestation, globalization of trade and travel, climate change, political instability, many of these factors that have come up repeatedly over the course of this meeting, they have fundamental effects on the dynamics of infectious disease, and these are sometimes very difficult to predict. So the vulnerability of populations to outbreaks of zoonotic disease has increased. The rise and spread of drug-resistant infections has increased. There's marked shifts in the ecology of known vectors, massive amplification of transmission through globally connected, high-density urban areas. All of these factors combine and interact in complex ways, fueling more complex epidemics that disrupt health systems, as Irene said, amplify distrust, and create significant and long-lasting socioeconomic effects. Sir Frank McFarlane Burnett, we quote him in this paper, he's often cited for his remark in the 1970s that the future of infectious diseases will be very dull. Well, I think we could agree if only it was so. And in fact, to the contrary, Mike Ryan has gone on record to state that we're entering a new phase of high-impact epidemics, a new normal, if you like, and we shouldn't expect the frequency of these events to reduce. So to respond effectively, we have to integrate tools and practices from a diverse range of established and emerging scientific, humanistic, political, diplomatic, and security fields. Rapidly evolving high-impact events that bring together communities, responders and researchers who don't routinely interact, who might not have a common language for discussing some of these sensitive issues. So fundamental to success, therefore, is respect and understanding of the contribution that each of these different parties brings. In a successful integrated approach, we must realize that our own knowledge and our own skills are just a small part of a rapidly expanding toolkit. And central to this approach must be the communities who are at risk and who are affected. Local people, communities, these are the first responders to any outbreak. So our collective involvement in preparation, in response, and in recovery is absolutely critical. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Juliet, for this wonderful talk. Excellent. Maybe I can ask the first question. So you just said the local communities, they are extremely important with regard to knowledge, etc. So how could they, what would be the toolbox to integrate them on a regular basis in these health systems?
So I think this comes back to this wanting to move away from us and them. We are the community. And I think Irene touched on it as well. Talking about participatory action research has always been a way to involve communities, but I think we've actually gone beyond that now. Some of the community feedback mechanisms I was alluding to, it's community-led, it's community-generated. We have community-based surveillance systems. The photograph that I put up from the communities in Harmonfield with the yellow t-shirts, they self-mobilized. They didn't have external support. So I think it's about a paradigm shift between how can we involve communities to actually saying communities are involved. What can we be learning from what's already happening on the ground? And of course, there are tools, there are methods that we can use to do that and to amplify their voices. But I think there's really been a shift, a sea change, if you like, since 2015, just in terms of how we approach that interface.
Yeah, thank you, Juliet, for a wonderful presentation. You know, when I took over the presidency of the Robert Koch Institute, one of the reasons I did it was I wanted to change the only biomedical perspective on outbreak management to more socially driven. And I'm particularly happy that we together in the strategic advisory group did a shift there. And I'm really happy to see how much is going on here because it's at the heart of the community, of course. But I have a question because if you look at the COVID-19 response, let's look at burials in Germany or in other countries. So many loved ones have died and they couldn't, and when they were buried, relatives sometimes couldn't attend the funeral.
Yeah.
Because of infection protection issues. So there's always a huge trade-off. And this trade-off, how can you assure, or how is it possible that this trade-off is discussed properly on a local community all over a country, for example, like Germany, which is a country who has a lot of knowledge and communicative issues. Why doesn't even Germany is possible to do it? And how can you then do it in such a country like in Uganda or now in South Sudan, which will be really tough again? But what is a recipe to improve, to bring this paradigm shift to local communities basically all over the world?
I wish I could give you a 10-word answer. Yeah, look, hugely challenging. I think in some ways what COVID-19 has shown us is that communicating some of those issues has actually been harder in Germany and in the UK than it has in some of the African countries where we work because of experience. And I think this comes back to Johanna's talk last night. There was a question about why does Sierra Leone and Guinea seem to have done so well, quote unquote, in terms of the health structures. Well, they're building on very recent experience where, as in Northern Europe, COVID-19 was a shock. It was something that most people never expected to happen here, this us and them idea again. This wasn't something that happened, you know, at the other side of the world. This was something that affected our communities. So I think, yes, there are commonalities about how we talk about what changes in behavior that need to happen, particularly around very sensitive issues like death and burial and memorialization. But it has to be done on a local context. And I think somebody mentioned yesterday about working in Germany with the mayors and keeping it at that local level. It was exactly the same in Liberia. When we started working with the mayors, with the local authorities, it was an absolute shift in the way that it worked, sort of really bringing things down to the local level. So again, I think this comes back to some of this standard operating procedures and how we tailor this to the local level. Right, we need overarching guidance, but then how does that actually play out in practice? Michael.
Thank you very much, Juliet, for your exciting presentation. Allow me a more academic question. We've discussed this a number of times. Your work involves understanding and analyzing cultures, worldviews, even silence, as you pointed out. Now, yesterday we heard the famous Peter Drucker quote that says, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So how do we marry quantitative and qualitative approaches in the social science, in public health? I think this is an issue that is not just relevant for our global health research, but also for policy making and planning in the future.
I think there's actually two questions there. One is, how do we triangulate between quantitative and qualitative data? And then the underlying question is, how do we measure what we're doing and measure the impact? And I think when I spoke about the sort of the nature of how we've had to look at our discipline and the role that social scientists have, it's incredibly difficult to talk about quantifying social science influence and impact and what that means. So I think there are some key examples, like I gave, boroughs where we know that there was a significant impact on transmission, and we were able to change interventions and things. But I think as we move forwards, we're really trying to grapple with indicators and how we do that measurement and what kind of data we will use as part of that measurement. So rather than trying to always quantify it numerically, what other types of data can we be collecting, whether it be community narratives or experiences, some of which, of course, will be anecdotal, and that comes with its own methodological challenges in terms of value statements and things as well. But you're right, Michael, absolutely. We all need to be thinking more creatively and more constructively, I think, about how we monitor progress over time. And I think this temporal element's very important as well. We need to be looking at immediate changes, but then changes over time and over the life course of an epidemic too, and shifting how we try to how we try to record those indicators over time.
Rainer Sauerborn from Heidelberg. Let me throw you flowers. We need more of you and your mindset in global health. Unfortunately, many of your colleagues are loath to intervene in a setting. They just look at it as a crystal, and intervening is anathema. So what we need is just what you are saying. And I also have a question. You mentioned the color of the body bags.
Yes.
And I was reminded of an experience that I had. The bed nets against malaria and others were originally white. And the Muslim community had a big problem because they reminded them of grave bags.
Yeah.
So they are now all colored green, So this is the importance of looking behind the surface. My question is the following. You showed the African lady smiling with her rubber apron, but she also had something, an amulet or something. Were there concepts of purity, contagion, of protection that are traditional, which were synergetic or against what we think is disease control? Of course. That was a short answer.
But we all have that, right? Like if you're true to yourself, we all have practices, maybe not physical amulets as such, but we all have ideas and notions that maybe don't fit with a biomedical or public health knowledge, but still have significance internally to us. So I have just gone back to the slide that you were mentioning. I can't comment as to what her necklace was. I will pay more attention to that in future. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think it's about... Your example is interesting because I think it's about how it comes back to this respect and understanding that actually there doesn't need to be one response. It's not black and white. There are grey areas. And I'm sure our psychology colleague would agree that sometimes it's not what's there on the ground, but it's also what makes those individuals feel safer, feel protected, and again, links to different notions of identity in society and collective living, collective spirit, right? I think the mosquito nets have always fascinated me because they also make very good fishing nets. And they also cover vegetable patches very well. So again, it's very easy for us to say, but you're not using the bed net as it's meant to be used. But the priority is that I'm a fisherman and I have holes in my fishing nets and I can use this much more creatively to gather fish. So yeah, I think how we look at objects, I think is very important. Thank you for your question and also for your comments. I appreciate it.
Yes, my name is Gerd Leux from Erlangen. I'm a physicist. I enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
And I remembered, I heard you say that there are these two categories. We know what we need to know, and we don't know what we need to know. And the second one, obviously, is the challenge. And I guess part of your work is moving elements from second category to the first category. So I was wondering, can you share with us an example where you identified something in the second category which was particularly striking for you in your work, or what? So that's my question.
Gosh, that's a great question. I've never been asked that before. I have lots of examples coming to mind, and I'm trying to think how to best articulate them. I think one, it now seems incredibly simple and obvious, was around, when I spoke about the mobility patterns, was around how they changed seasonality, in terms of seasonality. So when the rainy season stopped, mobility patterns changed dramatically. And I don't think at the time we had really projected that far. So I think sometimes it's just the most simple things which actually you look back retrospectively and say, well, that was really obvious. How could we be so stupid not to actually predict that that was going to happen? But at the time, you know, you're at the coalface and you're sort of focusing on what matters here and there. And part of the reason that I think SHAP has worked so well is that we have colleagues who are deployed on the ground, but we also have behind them as a fundamental, wonderful resource, colleagues who know these areas very well, but aren't caught up in the day-to-day evolution of a response. So it's actually those colleagues who, yes, we throw out questions to from a response saying, I don't understand this, or this is coming up, or do we have information about this? But oftentimes it's those colleagues who are a little bit physically removed who will say, you haven't thought about this yet, and this is coming around the corner, and you need to get on top of it in advance. So that sort of internal, external perspective can be really useful. Thank you.
Wonderful presentation. Thanks a lot. My name is Thomas Mettenlath. I'm director of the Friedrich-Loeffler Institute, Federal Research Institute for Animal Health in Germany. Actually, I have two questions. I mean, we had tremendously successful disease eradication campaigns in the past with smallpox, with rinderpest. I mean, polio went straight forward. I mean, we had a lot of community engagement. I mean, all the issues that you already touched on. So, I mean, are we reinventing the wheel today compared to what our forefathers did, or did the situation fundamentally change? And the second point is, I'm also, pretty much involved in One Health issues. So, I mean, for example, we had in rabies eradication, vaccination of dogs. It's the same thing. I mean, you need community involvement. A lot of efforts have been taken there. I mean, how much was that involved in the issues that you just mentioned in these, outbreak situations in the recent decade or so? Thank you.
Maybe I'll start with the second question first. So I think One Health is such a helpful way of approaching the interrelationship of these issues. And I was speaking with Suzanne yesterday that we've done some work again on the border area between DRC and South Sudan and Uganda, where actually you have to take a One Health approach because you're looking at issues around bushmeat and the bushmeat trade, conservation, the politics of conservation, livelihoods. So I think, taking this One Health perspective is absolutely fundamental, and I think it has to be at the core of a lot of the work that we're going to be doing going forward. To answer your first question, would it be cheeky to say both? I do think we're reinventing the wheel, absolutely. I think if you speak to colleagues who are engaged now in monkeypox, they were like are banging their heads against the wall in terms of why haven't we learned from HIV/AIDS? Why are we still having these conversations? But I do think things have also changed in really important ways. Again, yesterday we talked about social media. We talked about, different methods of communication and things. So I do think fundamentally the community engagement piece has very much changed in terms of the speed, the pressures, the different types of information, the different influences, and linked then to issues, more macro issues around politics, nationalism, isolationism and things. So I do think you are right to pose the question, are we just repeating what we already know? Yes, to some extent, but I think the context in which we're working has also changed. And I'm not sure we've quite got to grips with that yet. So I think some of the conversations later on today around the use of artificial intelligence, for example, is going to be, really key to all of us going forwards. How we work better with big data, for example, as well. Social scientists, we still like our paper and our pencil and our ethnographic methods. We need to be getting much better at using big data and different types of data sets. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your presentation and also the very impressive work that you're doing. We had a brief exchange yesterday about studying anthropology, and I confess that I gave up because I wasn't satisfied with what was offered to me in Munich. Now you studied in Oxford, and my question now relates to, could you name things that you took from your training in anthropology that are really helpful in your work? Is it like concepts, methods, or is it actual procedures, or none of this?
Have I convinced you to come back to anthropology? I think, Oxford is a very classic department. The ghost of Evans Pritchard, it looms in Oxford. So the notion of putting applied before the word anthropology still has some of my Oxford colleagues puts them in an uncomfortable position. But to answer your question just very briefly, I think, yes, certainly the methods. The methods, the ethnographic approach, underlies everything that we do. And yes, we're developing new methods, we're developing much more engaged, sort of interactive, creative methods, particularly working with vulnerable populations, with adolescents, with children. We don't need to just do focus group discussions or interviews. There are other ways that we can work. I think my training at Oxford, to be honest, I think the grounding that it gave me was a rigor and a scientific rigor and a respect for science and a respect for multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary working. I think I have enjoyed in the last few years being able to go back to Oxford and to NYU and be able to actually convey some of this new ways of working to a new generation of anthropologists and social sciences who are coming up, and saying that there are other options and there are other avenues, but to do that effectively, I still believe you need that sort of fundamental theoretical grounding as well, and then you're in a position where you can pick and choose. So it's nice to have that option.